Hey YouTube, isn't it always the way when you've already got two projects going is when one comes out of the blue and has to be done right now? This fragile little bundle is from the folks at E Street Plastics. What it is acrylic. Specifically, this is what they call P99, a non-glare acrylic sheet. There's 11 of them in here and they're all 16 by 20. In case you were wondering, 11 is because of quantity discounts. Basically, buying 11 is the same price as 10 because that's the next step in discount. So anyway, I'm going to set this aside because the real project, now that this is here, is the frame that it goes into. So picture frame. It's a real easy project, right? Take 4 pieces, cut some angles, glue it together, and you're done. Yes and no. That is the basic procedure for making a picture frame. The complication is in the tolerances. You don't have any. The corners have got to be 45 degrees and the opposing sides have got to be the same length, or this is not going to come together at the corners, which means it's going to be ugly, and worse, it's going to be really weak. And speaking of ugly, these boards, as pretty and shiny as the grain is, are just rectangles. They're not very aesthetically appealing. They don't look much like a frame. So we're going to have to do something about gussying up the profile of these things while we're at it. Okay, I'm starting with one board here that was milled flat and square. I cut it into 2 sections and then ripped it into, these are 2 3/16 inch wide pieces. The milling and sizing of the lumber is the first place you can go off the rails with a picture frame. You need flat, square, and straight edges in order to register for when you cut the 45s and to measure your lengths accurately. These boards are in real good shape. They are ready to go to the saw and cut the miters on them. But first, I'm going to take them to the router table and I'm going to cut the rabbet that will ultimately hold that acrylic. I'm doing the rabbets first because sometimes when you cut them, they blow out a little bit on the end. These pieces are over length right now. If it blows out here, no big deal. We'll get rid of it when we cut the miter. I start by zeroing out the height of the rabbeting bit so that I know what kind of depth I'm cutting. As it turns out, the exact depth of this rabbet is not critical. The width is, which is why I'm using the router table, so I know I'm getting a precise ½ inch. The other thing that is fairly critical is that you don't take too deep of a cut on your final pass. Especially on a stringy wood like white oak, it's important to go thin if you want a clean cut. One of these days I'm going to build myself an actual miter sled, but I haven't gotten around to it, so instead I just do this. I take the sled that I have for 90 degrees, and I clamp right over here flush with the edge of the fence, standard old speed square. You'd be amazed, for as inexpensive as these squares are, they're pretty darn accurate. I placed it on my right side because that way the rabbet is facing up, leaving me the workpiece flush to the sled right up here where I need to register it. Although the first cut isn't that critical, we're just establishing the 45 on one end of all of these pieces so that we know where we're measuring from. Using the speed square is how I make sure I get a 45-degree cut on the ends, but the other critical aspect of making a frame is that the rails are the same length. So what I've done is I've taken my 2 long ones in this case, and I flushed them up with my fingers here at the end, and then blue taped them together as a sandwich. What that's going to let me do is cut both rails at the same time so that I'm sure I get exactly the same length on both of them. I measure and mark the length of these pieces on the outside, the long edge of it, because you can hook the tape measure over the points. It requires a little math to figure out what the final dimension should be, but it's a lot more accurate. Now, if your rough stock is a little bit closer to your finished dimension than what I have here, you won't run into this problem. But I have hit the limits of what will fit in my sled here, and I'm not up to my line yet. So I'm going to have to cut this at least twice in order to be able to get the line up here where the saw blade is. You want to take the fuzzies off the table saw cuts, but you want to be real careful because you do not want to round over any of these surfaces. You want nice crisp edges on all the miters. With the frame pieces cut to length, you can go back and start working on the decorative bits. I'm using a 45-degree chamfering bit to give a nice little slope to go down to the actual acrylic. And then on the back side, I'm doing a 3/8 inch round over. It's moment of truth time here. Find out how well these 4 corners come together. I still say that blue tape is the best miter clamp ever invented. I'm thinking I can live with this. All 4 of those miters came together pretty well. If you're happy with the fit up of your frame, you can move on to getting ready to glue it up. But miters, as mentioned earlier, are not the strongest joints. It's end grain to end grain. So even though you have, 1.4 times the width of your rail stock as surface, it's just not gonna last a long, long time if you do nothing but glue it. On larger frames, I love the look and the strength of splines, but on a frame this size, I couldn't go thick enough on the material to make a spline really workable. So that means some sort of internal reinforcement to this joint. I'm going to use biscuits. This is a number 0, small little biscuit. I'm going to run around these 4 corners and label them 1, 2, 3, 4 so that I can get it back together the same way after I cut the biscuit slots. And I'm going to use this. This is a little dollar store plastic triangle that will just hook over the corner of the frame and give me a consistent place to mark on all of them. Gluing up a frame like this is greatly simplified by the fact that we're using a mechanical fastener of sorts in between the various pieces. You do want to make sure you get really, really good glue coverage on your biscuits or dowels or whatever you're using, because they are providing a lot of the strength. These web clamps are probably the best way to get pressure on one of these things, with one little caveat. These web clamps are mostly pretty slick at bringing corners together, but if you have a frame or something else that is not quite as tall as the clamp is wide, it has a tendency to want to twist the pieces up or down. Some cawls across the top with spacer blocks to make sure that you hit both the long and short rails with each one will keep it clamped down flat and make sure that the joint dries square. Surface prep is super critical in a picture frame because it's designed to be looked at and in good light. So I sand the fronts of my picture frames all the way to 320. Obviously you don't need that for the whole thing. I'm using wipe-on poly here, good old Armor Seal, and I do make sure that I get even coverage front and back because I don't want this thing to expand and contract unevenly and take the risk of the miters opening up or it warping. One of the upsides to making your own frames is that you can make them any size you want. I got all 16 by 20 acrylic because, frankly, it's the best deal. For some reason, this particular size is really popular, and so the per sheet price is actually lower than some smaller sizes, and it's really, really easy to cut down if you have the right saw blade. In my case, that turns out to be a 200 tooth blade is the only high tooth count one I have. The other trick to cutting these plastics, believe it or not, is to go fast, to go really fast. Because what happens to these edges when they get messed up isn't that they tear out, it's that they melt. So push this plastic through your saw just about as fast as your motor will allow. Usual routine with the finish, I let it set up for 24 hours, knocked it back with steel wool and mineral spirits, put a second coat on. So I have a well-protected frame at this point. Frames don't take a lot of abuse. They don't need 14 coats. But I still have that nice, close to the wood look, as they say. Time for some assembly. The protective paper that comes on this acrylic leaves behind a film from the adhesive that holds it on there, but plain old window cleaner takes it right off. So in goes the acrylic. In goes the mat, which, by the way, I just bought an off-the-shelf 16 by 20 mat and cut it down to fit my custom size here. And I don't have the photo that goes in this frame. The recipient of the frame has it. So I just took the piece of cardboard for the back and covered it with a little shiny aluminum Christmas wrap just so that it doesn't look quite so bad when it comes to the unveiling. To keep everything in the frame, I like these offset clips because when you have a really fat frame with a big profile on it, you lots of times need that offset to push down into the inside. But in the case of this frame, everything comes out sort of pretty flush. So what you do is you take one of these bent ones and you throw it in your vise and you flatten it, and it works just great. Well, and call me old school if you will, but I like good old-fashioned picture wire for hanging frames. It gives you a lot of flexibility as to where exactly your fastener is, because you can slide the frame back and forth on the wire. So if your hole that you put in the wall or your nail or your stud or whatever isn't exactly where you wanted it, you can cheat the picture over a little bit and get it straight. Not the most glamorous project in the world, and obviously it's going to look a whole lot better with a picture in it than a piece of Christmas wrap, but it's done. It's ready to go to its recipient. Don't let these miters scare you off of making frames. There's a couple of different ways to do it, and if you take your time, plan everything out, you can get them nice and tight and looking just fine. Questions or comments, leave them below. While you're there, think about hitting that subscribe button. There's a couple of semi-cool shop projects coming up that you might want to be notified about. But they're going to have to wait just a little while because I got a side trip to California. In the meantime, you stay safe, YouTube.